Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I think today's episode is going to be very, very interesting. I've been in touch with this gentleman for a while, and of course, folks, I've always been fascinated in this idea of diffusionism, the idea of pre-Columbian contact from the old world to the new world. Of course, to many of you in the audience who are believers in the Book of Mormon, believe that there was pre-Columbian contact with the old world to the new world a long time ago. And there have been people throughout the years who have identified artifacts. Some of them are hoaxes, others have been authenticated, like the Bat Creek Stone. Scott Walter authenticated that, and he came on the channel to discuss that. But then he also came back on to talk about the Burroughs Cave and show that those objects that he had in his collection are hoaxes. Now, of course, I've had people in the Burroughs Cave community reach out to me and say, "Hey, we've got some real artifacts." I'm like, "Come on, bring them in. I don't care. I'll talk to anybody who wants to present their evidence." And just like last week, I had Dr. Miles Jones on to talk about these metal plates from the Middle East that last year I had Dan McClellan come on my program to debunk, and they came back and say, "Hey, we've got a translation of these supposedly fake hoaxes." I says, "Okay, bring it on." And well, today I want to just preface this is that Lance is a geologist in the state of Utah. Lance Weaver, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
And Lance is him and I have been in contact for a while, and he's going to present some evidence of pre-Columbian contact that he finds very compelling. I can also tell you that Scott Walter considers these relics, the Tucson relics, to be one of the strongest evidences of pre-Columbian contact. So I thought, let's talk about that. But also, Lance, you are an interesting guy because you also have your own Book of Mormon model that's takes both in the Mesa and the Heartlander models and kind of combines them in a similar way that Ed Goebel, of course, has done too. And I know you've spoken with Ed and has been on my program, and I'm actually going to be taping an interview with Ed next week. Just to let people know that Lance is not necessarily the originator of this, but there's a couple other people that have been involved in this, including Ed, and I want to give due credit to him as well in the work that he's been doing on this. But Lance, you've got so many interesting things you want to share. Before we get started, did you want to just kind of talk a little bit about your background, and then we can talk about this great presentation you're going to give us?
Yeah, I'll give you a background here, and also a little bit like Ed Goebel kind of supports the Heartland is Hinterland model, and that really is quite different from my model. There's no one else who has kind of the Mexican highland being the center. He just basically holds to the exact same Grijalva, Usumacinta, Mesoamerican models, but then just has like Cumorah v. Cumorah in New York, right? Which is really it's pretty radically different from my model. So I'll explain that a little bit more and how they really differ and the problems that I see with just the Heartland is Hinterland, how you have to have, the way that I do it is the only way that really makes it sense in my mind. But yeah, as far as my background, like you mentioned, I'm a geologist. I mean, I have a lot of articles online that if you just look up Utah Geology, you can find my name. I've got peer-reviewed um, articles on geology. I've been a geologist for 25 years, kind of pioneer in the 3D visualization space with geologic mapping. And I really know my stuff when it comes to geology. And so I've kind of applied a lot of that same stuff to Book of Mormon archaeology. And I've worked on both of them for like 20 years. And I have a really open mind to kind of radical ideas, even though that in my professional life, I'd, stick to the book, stick to the more normal narratives. And I definitely can sympathize with those, like with the stuff I'm going to be talking about, whether it be the Tucson artifacts, which are, debunked by most scholarly consensus. And there's a lot of ideas like that I was among that camp, right? I mean, for 20 years, even these kind of fringe things, even though there was other ones that I thought was more convincing, I just kind of believed the scholarly consensus and thought, oh yeah, these probably are hoaxes or these are lame. But there's a couple of things that I'll show at the beginning here that they literally just they blew my paradigm. Like when I found these and really looked into them, and they're Mesoamerican artifacts that match so well with things that are in the old world that it made me lose all all faith in the scholarly consensus. Like they are so convincing, right? That there's literally zero way in my mind that I could like join that scholarly paradigm and be like, yeah, these are fake. Because once you see them, it's like there's no way. Like there's zero chance that it's a coincidence, that these isn't diffusionary contact. And once that happened, then I'm like, holy cow, well, I need to go revisit every single one of the other things that I've completely dismissed, for 15, 20 years. and really study them and be like, well, maybe there was continual, even though it's sporadic, even though it's probably among these kind of secretly guarded trade guilds that they don't publicize their trade channels, right? They're going to these other places and kind of keeping it a secret because they own these shipping channels, they own these trade networks, and they don't want to tell other people about the trade networks. So anyway, once I kind of found out that was a reality and saw the convincing stuff, I had to revisit everything. And then among those, maybe 50% of them fake, but 50% of them I've kind of thought, I bet you these ones are real, even though it's not completely convincing. They're pretty dang convincing. But the first ones I'll show you are 100% convincing. Like I don't say this lightly and I don't throw insults. But if you look at these first ones and you say, oh yeah, that's just coincidence, like I question your intelligence. And
Okay.
you'll know, you'll see when I show them that it's like, wow, how could that be a coincidence? There's no way.
So, and we have to also accept the fact that over the last couple decades, the scholarly consensus has been pushed back on. The Clovis first model is no longer the major dominant narrative in the scholarly community.
Yeah,
Um, so now, and we keep on pushing back the time frame of when
yeah,
people's first started coming here. So we have to rethink a lot of things. What's also interesting is you have like Michael Coe, who of course did his thing about how the Book of Mormon is not historically accurate and doesn't believe that it represents a Mesoamerican culture, but then at the same time is open to says that he thinks there's a Chinese influence happening in Mesoamerican culture. So he's
yeah,
a diffusionist as well in one
yeah.
sense.
At least
So I think
Austronesian.
yeah, it's really fascinating. So I think that sometimes when people have their particular mindset, they any evidence that comes forth that pushes back against their narrative, they just immediately dismiss as a hoax. And look, I think there are a lot of hoaxes out there, no question, but I think sometimes we have to relook. And now anthropologists and geologists and archaeologists are rethinking a lot of different things about the peopling of the New World. And this kind of then gives some people the idea that well maybe the Book of Mormon can be a useful guide during this reconsidering of these things. So I want so start wherever you want to start. Do you want to start with the Tucson relics, or do you want to start with your Book of Mormon model?
No,
Or
no, because the Tucson relics are some of the less convincing, right? And so
oh,
I'm
okay,
going to start with these more convincing ones, and
great,
they're
okay,
further back in time.
that
Yeah,
sounds
and
great.
so let me kind
Oh,
of share my screen here. These are kind of slides from a book I'm writing. Um, let's see. Let me go to the share here.
and just remind you, just as he's pulling up the screen share, Lance has written in peer-reviewed journals. He's a geologist, so he knows the scientific method very well. So I think it's very important to kind of pay close attention to what he has to say today.
Okay, so I will do this full screen. All
Okay.
right. And yeah, but like you were saying before, like it's interesting to note that even Viking exploration of America has been questioned for a long time, right? It
Hmm.
wasn't until Lost Meadows was found in Nova Scotia that there was really convincing archaeological proof of Viking incursions into America. So it obviously completely established in Iceland. But then Greenland was even a little bit more spurious. But then as you got into America, there was a lot of people who kind of fought against that, that Greenland was the actual, Vineland that they had come down to, or
Hmm.
sorry, that America was. And so, but archaeology has completely proven that. And
Yes.
I'll show some more stuff where I think they came into America a lot more than just Nova Scotia. So still, that is the established kind of limit to their travel. The Vikings kind of came into Canada and even the stuff that's in Maine is hotly debated,
Yeah,
right?
and then of course we got Scott Walter and the whole Kensington runestone found in Minnesota.
Yeah, yeah.
Another
There's a
example.
number of runestones, a number of them. Yep, and
Hmm.
they are still debated. And so
Hmm.
and it's kind of funny. It's like, well, I mean, at what point should there be a scholarly consensus? And even if there isn't a scholarly consensus, should we still be like, well, probably it isn't that big of a jump to be like if they're in Nova Scotia, they're probably in Maine, and the Maine penny is probably a legitimate artifact, from the Viking lands, and the
Hmm.
Kensington rune stone. I mean, is there really, what does it say? Does it say, I'm Eric the Red and I came, if it says something like that, then you can probably be like, well, maybe this is a hoax. There was a lot of people writing in runic back then. But if it says something like completely weird, like, we came from the lake and went on to the next, then maybe it seems more legitimate. But
Okay.
yeah, let's jump in here.
Yeah, let's take a look at what's on the screen here.
Okay. All right. So I can't see what everyone else can see, but I'm hoping that we're looking at the same thing. Now, these are monuments that are down in Mesoamerica, right? Okay, and these first ones that we're going to look at, date from between 850 and 700 BC, right?
Okay.
And so hopefully you can see my cursor. Can you kind of see where my
I
cursor
can
is
see your
pointing so I can
cursor.
point at
Yep.
things? All right. So here on my left is Monument 19 from La Venta, right? And La Venta shares like some really interesting features with some sites in England, but these correlations really go with Assyrian motifs, right? So La Venta is right there in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, so that narrow part of southern Mexico. And no one debates whether this is fake, right? This is an Olmec piece of artwork from La Venta, a well-known Olmec site that has a lot of megalithic artwork. Um, and you can see we've got like motifs here that carry on throughout Mesoamerican culture, right? We've got a Quetzalcoatl bird right here.
Hmm.
It's shaped in a quadriform, which is a very common kind of shape, kind of a cave-like shape. And then we've got this guy who looks like he has kind of a fish legs, and a bird mask. So I hope you can see that his mask is a avian mask, right? So it's a
Okay.
man in a bird mask,
Okay.
and he's carrying this satchel, right?
Yep. Hmm.
Now, and these motifs persist all the way into past Teotihuacan times, even into Toltec and later. So like here's a Toltecan dancer where he's wearing these same motifs. We've got like this eagle head dress, so an anthropomorphic bird.
Okay.
Okay, so those are both clearly established Mesoamerican artifacts. Now let's compare those to these Assyrian motifs that we find in Nimrud. Okay, so right here we've got this anthropomorphic birdman,
Hmm.
right? This is on a wall relief in Nimrud in Mesopotamia, right? In the old world, Iraq. Do you see how? So not only is he a birdman, same anthropomorphic type of bird, but he's carrying this satchel,
Hmm.
right? And this isn't just like a one-off. There are many, many examples of this satchel. It's kind of part of their priesthood cult, and there's some debate on what the satchel is, but the consensus is that he's carrying something that's full of date palm pollen. And this thing in his hand here, this dauber, almost looks like a pine cone. This is
Hmm.
what they use to pollinate the date palms. And date palms have like an interesting, sex life. They can't self-pollinate very well. So if you want to have a very productive crop, you have to hand pollinate them. You have to save the palm and hand pollinate the date palms. And so they're somehow integrating this into their priesthood cult, kind of like you have to, if you're going to be a king and have a good kingdom, you've got to help people have kids. But you got the same thing here with this winged, kind of like a genie, I think is what they typically call it. But he's got the same thing, the same dauber and the same bag, right?
Okay.
So, but compare these two here, this avian
Hmm.
dressed man with a satchel,
Okay.
and really like think in your head of two cultures evolving independently, right? From 12,000 BC when people first came to the New World in the Brahmana model, and really think like after 12,000 years, these two groups just by chance decided to come up with like these priesthood motifs of these birdmen with a satchel, right? And maybe if this was the only one, you might be like, well, that's pretty weird for sure, but maybe coincidence. There are weird coincidences out there, but we're going to keep going, right? So the next one here, these are similarly late dated motifs in Egypt on the right here. And we've got our same La Venta motif on the left, right? So, the dating of this thing is pretty difficult. It's probably around 700 BC. But that same quadriform with the bird-headed snake, right? So
Hmm.
that's the same thing that's going on here in the Isis temple in Egypt, dating to around 700 BC, right? This is called Happy's Cave. And so we've got Happy in here in this bird-headed snake forming this kind of quadriform, cave-like structure
Hmm.
that he's sitting inside. So literally every aspect, and I there's another Babylonian motif where they've got a man with this fish bottom, right? Like every single motif of this La Venta um, statue here is found in the old world. Like every single one of them.
So you're saying this is a mix of both Assyrian and Egyptian art combined in Mesoamerica. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, yeah, and I mean clearly anybody in the old world and any old world archaeologist is going to look at these Assyrian Egyptian motifs and be like, well, that's culture fusion. This was one big culture. I mean, by that time, Egypt and Egypt had ruled northern Israel for like 500 years at this time,
Hmm.
and had been ruled by the Hyksos from Asia before that. So there was a very unified culture between Egypt and Babylon. And no one is going to see these motifs and be like, well, that happened in a vacuum. That's like, no, I mean, Assyria and Egypt have very common motifs because they are part of a similar culture, right? There's a lot of cultural diffusion going on between those cultures.
Okay,
But
so
then,
we have evidences in the old world of mixing of Egyptian and Assyrian things like you
absolutely,
see here in the New World.
absolutely, absolutely. I
Okay.
mean, the Assyrians were conquering into Egypt, right?
Okay.
So those empires were completely conquering each other over and over, all the way back from 2000 BC. So yeah, and no one's going to question that. And no one's going to, even from the artwork, no one would, even if you saw this in China, you'd be like, yeah, there's probably some cultural diffusion going on with these dragon motifs and these bird-headed snakes in Egypt, right? Because there's clearly evidence of communication between the Middle East and China. But yet, for some reason, when it's in America, it's like, oh, that's just chance. That's happenstance, right?
All right.
But we can keep going. Like those alone are unbelievably convincing. To just say those are coincidence, that really is kind of bonkers. To have a Birdman with a satchel, right? That's like, oh, that these two cultures separated by an entire half a world away, just came up with these motifs independently because they like birds and satchels. I mean, that's just and caves with bird-headed snakes. I mean, it's really pretty silly to try and suggest that those things happen in a vacuum, happen independently. But in the old world, right, well, obviously we've got tons of culture diffusion because we see all the way up into Anatolia these same things where there's the dauber. Instead of a satchel, this time he's got a bull, right? But he's doing the same thing with the date palms, even though there aren't date palms in that region. Same thing here. We've got the satchel and the dauber by the bird-headed motifs, right? And these are all up in Eastern Turkey because that was a very popular priesthood motif that lasted for a while. Okay, so here we have another one. So even a little bit later, as we're getting closer to Toltec times, we've got these motifs. So this time, kind of this opposing priesthood cult, instead of having the bird-headed guy, he's got bird talon feet, right?
Hmm.
And then he's got a feline head, right?
Okay.
And we see that motif in lots of different artwork. And this is all old world stuff. This is all near Mexico City. And then here in the same region of those ones we were talking about in Assyria, we've got the exact same thing. Um, so here we've got this feline head with bird feet, right? So they're sharing the exact same. Yeah, and I mean, you read a lot of text with these, like all of these had deep symbolism, right? When they're drawing any kind of anthropomorphic figure, they're kind of keying in on the ideas of like, this person is fierce, like a jaguar or like a lion, and
Hmm.
has, and we see that in the Bible too. We see that symbology built into their wording. But once again, very similar motifs. Bird-feeted feline anthropomorphic figure. Bird-feeted, you know, feline-headed anthropomorphic figure. Once again, what's the chances that is a coincidence?
Hmm.
So we see it again. Here we've got the bird-headed figure and the feline-headed figure side by side in the same ruins. And it's really the similar thing in Assyria. We've got the same type of motifs. And we also see them in Egypt, where they're using kind of these same kind of god motifs to express their kind of cultural ideas. Here's another super convincing one. We've got this, so a griffin, essentially, right? These are horse griffins. These are
Okay.
found in Mesopotamia, but they probably even came from Egypt. That could be debated, but um, these are clearly Egyptian motifs, even though they're found in Mesopotamia in kind of a stash of ivories. And you can see this griffin, this bird-headed feline, right? We've got this lion body, lion tail, bird head, and he's trampling a captive, right? Well, that exact same motif exists
Hmm.
in Chalcanzingo,
Hmm.
halfway between La Venta and the Mexican highland, where we've got this bird-headed kind of a feline body and a bird-headed motif trampling a captive, right? And we see it in Egypt as well. So in hieroglyphs in some of the tombs, here it's just a human-headed feline trampling a captive. And we know that symbolism from the Bible, right? That idea of trampling a captive, like your culture is like smashing and trampling the people. You have complete dominion over another culture, so that's a popular motif. But you see it here in Chalcanzingo in Mesoamerica. So I mean, I'd ask everybody again, like these things date from like 700 BC, 7 to 800 BC. What on earth are the chances that all of these motifs, right now we've hit on like 7 or 8 of them, that all of these motifs appeared by chance. I mean, literally, when you have two cultures diverge and you have like a divergent evolution happening for 10,000 years, which is what we're saying here, right? They came across the Bering Straits, according to the scholarly consensus, 10,000 BC. And I mean, if you're looking at some of the other little sites down in South America, then maybe 20,000 BC. But you've clearly got the main thrust coming across the Bering Straits, supposedly at 10,000 BC, and they are evolving completely separately. I mean, you wouldn't even expect them to have like similar writing forms, right? Like what you see with the knot writing down in the Incas in South America, like that's what you expect. Like one
Hmm.
person's using numerals and one person's using knots in a rope to try and communicate. Like when you have 10,000 years of divergent evolution, that's what you expect, like radically different ideas, right? Radically different technologies and ways of thinking and languages and differently writing systems. But instead, we have, Mayan writing, which it kind of probably evolves from this Isthmian script that comes from these areas of Tehuantepec, right? And it's really fairly similar. A lot of people say, no, it's so different, but it's like it's still fairly similar in the context that we're talking to Egyptian. But then you tack on top all of these motifs that we're talking about that are identical. Like these are identical motifs in both cultures. And you're still trying to tell me that this is, that somehow there's no diffusionism going here? Like, no way. Once again, this is going into the area where I say, how can any person who has any experience in archaeology, like, and has really studied these things, like, find me a place in Australia where you've got these similar motifs, you know, where you had 20,000 feet of divergent evolution, and yet you got similar motifs like this. No, absolutely not. In fact, you don't even find these strong of matches between China and Assyria. And yet they were in communication. There was trade and diffusion going on there. And you don't find this strong of motifs.
Okay.
So we are talking about some kind of a colony. And the location where they're found even hits this point home even more because they're on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So if you had people going around the world and they need a Panama Canal, they're going to pick one of those little areas like the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and build a little colony there and ship it 100 miles across the isthmus so that then they can have some trade between China and Africa and the Mediterranean. And that appears to be what has happened here, right? And I'll go into a couple more motifs really quick. I mean, we've got like Asiatic looking things that some of the weapons even between Chalco and some of the things that you see in the old world. See these horns that this dude has? Like that is really similar to this Mesopotamian um, motif that you have. They've got the same type of garb, even, and the same type of weapons, right? We can keep going. And this is another example of where I lost my faith in scholarly consensus. Because when I saw stuff like this, I'm like, well, crap. Like they are moving the goalposts. I mean, worse than like a creationist, than the craziest religionists that you've ever seen, that you yell at, you're like, how can you move the goalpost? Well, here you might say, like, well, what if we actually found an artifact, from the old world in the new world? Well, then it would prove to me. Well, they did that. They did that, right? Here in Toluca, they found an Etruscan figurine. This head was found under a second subfloor within Toluca, next to Mexico City, right? Clearly Etruscan. Like these are all examples of actual Etruscan figurines that they found as far away as India and Spain. So they know these things were widely spread, right? So they went all the way from India to Spain. They find hundreds of them. Yeah, I've just got an example of like, what, 7 here or so.
Hmm.
They found one in Mexico. And this professor, like I've read his actual kind of notes. He says up and down, I didn't plan this and plant this, and my grad student did not plant this. But every other professor, came out and said, oh, well, this must have been planted. Like clearly it's an Etruscan figurine, so we know it's not fake. And clearly it was found inside an archaeological dig by actual professors. But how do they move the goalpost? They say, oh, well, it was planted. Someone snuck into your dig and planted this. Or one of your grad students is trying to play a trick, even though he says he didn't, right? But we're just going to say he's lying. So what kind of lengths are you going to go out to try and disprove, like to hold onto your theory that there was no pre-Columbian contact, even though we already proved that there is pre-Columbian contact, because we know the Vikings were here. But I mean, it once again, this is just like beyond it. And when this comes to Book of Mormon ideas, like the Book of Mormon, we're saying that Nephi and Lehi came to America at 600 BC. Well, that is right after all those Assyrian motifs are showing up, right? And even among Mormon communities, no Mormon thinks that they were following established shipping channels, that there were these like kind of secretive trade guilds, and that they actually used those trade guilds to come to America. They all think that it happened completely by the power of God. And maybe that's true, but that's a matter of faith. But
Mhm.
here we're finding actual archaeological evidence that points to the fact that it's like, no, there were groups that were somehow creating trade corridors and diffusing their cultural ideas into the New World. It suddenly now makes the Book of Mormon a lot more believable. And you have to do the same thing where you're moving the goalpost to try and deny it and be like, oh, well, it's all, we're going to just dismiss this all as fake. Yeah. Well, we'll go on a little bit further. I've got so many, but I mean, these motifs between this is kind of a well-known idea. This is Zappa,
Yeah.
Stella, and for a while, like a lot of Mormons, and this is probably the problem because you get kind of professors, like these Mormon professors came and they hooked onto this thing. They're like, this is actually straight out of the Book of Mormon because there's a dream from Lehi and he has this, tree of life dream, and they're like, this is the tree of life. And
Uh-huh.
then, you look at all the other motifs in it, and other critics were like, yeah, this does not look like that dream. And then everybody drops it instead of
Hmm.
looking more closely at what they should look. And it's like, no, 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 no. Once again, the dream that's in the Book of Mormon is coming from Old World motifs. And the Zappa figurine is pulling from Old World motifs, right? So this is not Lehi's tree in his vision. Lehi's tree is coming from a tree that existed within Mesopotamia and Egyptian cultural and religious ideas, right? So this tree, the sacred tree that you find in Egyptian artwork and Egyptian mythology, often has kind of a god that comes out of it, and the god changes depending on the region of Mesopotamia that you're in. But you see kind of that god that comes out and offers a libation out of the tree, right? You see it all over in this Egyptian artwork. You've got the exact same thing happening in this figurine. You've got some kind of a being coming out of the tree and offering a libation. And you can kind of see these like sycophants here that are like receiving the libation from the goddess. And here you have the kind of same thing, these same people receiving the libation. And if that was it, you might think, well, maybe that's kind of coincidence, even though that's once again, we're going into area that to call this coincidence is kind of insane. But here you've got like a a duck type of, aquatic bird, and then you've got this feline that are both kind of on either side of the tree. Well, you've got that exact same motif in Egypt, right? So in Ramses 2, this time he's the one kind of within the divine tree, but then you've got this ibis, this bird and feline gods that are representing very specific ideas, in these cultural minds on either side of the tree in the exact same way. So all the motifs are there. Once again, we've got all these Egyptian motifs in the same place as this Izapa motif, and they date to very similar time periods. Um, and some of these things are kind of fairly hard to date, unless you like tunnel underneath the statue and can actually find some wood or something to radiocarbon date. Um, but once again, what are the chances? What are the chances that this is just happenstance? It's just coincidence. These guys just all liked the exact same animals and decided to make them into their god motifs and goddess motifs, and they like to use trees in the same way. It's so ridiculous. It's ridiculous, right? To try and assign this to happenstance or coincidence. Like after you've got this many, now you're in that territory where you're like, okay, that's baloney. Like anyone who's going to try and call this coincidence, you shouldn't be trusted anymore. That's baloney. There's no way, right? There's too many, and they are too specific and too similar to trying to assign these as just happenstance. And when you think about it, it's really kind of silly, right? When you like, I've read all of Herodotus, all of Diodorus, like all of the oldest histories that you can find. Like I've read them clean through. And when you read through those, these societies were incredibly advanced. Even with the Hyksos coming into Egypt, like the Phoenician trading vessels, they were going far and wide, and they spanned the Suez Canal. So they're traveling all the way through the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain. And it's hard to say exactly when the Phoenicians were making it up to northern Spain, but you've got a lot of the stones of northern France, and Stonehenge itself, which really kind of feels like that, just that megalithic structure feels a lot like the Sardinian megalithic structures. And they're all the way around the Cape. You see a ton of those in southern Spain. So, and those all date to the late Bronze Age. Like these are like 2000 BC to 1600 BC motifs. So they're and even the Great Pyramids themselves, which date to 2200 BC, 22 to 2400 BC, right? You've got Stonehenge that dates to that age. You've got the Great Pyramids that date to that age. You've got Caral in southern South America, right on the coast of Peru, that dates to that age. And they're all kind of these similar megalithic advanced structures at 2000 BC, right? So there's very powerful evidence that there are strong maritime cultures. And the same thing is happening in China. Like if you Google the Wikipedia article for the Maritime Silk Road, late Bronze Age, we've got evidence of a maritime Silk Road where there's like a Phoenician type of people, probably Austronesians, that are ruling shipping channels from India to China. And so if that's happening at 2000 BC, and they're going from China to India, and then probably even back then to Madagascar, but certainly by later they're going to Madagascar because Madagascar has a Austronesian language, right? They colonized it so much that their language stuck. And by Austronesian, I mean Indonesia. So we've got people sailing from China to Indonesia to Madagascar, and these people in Indonesia are kind of ruling those shipping channels. If that's like 8,000 miles. So if they're going all the way from Spain and northern France to Egypt and the other side of the Suez Canal, going from there to China, and definitely from India to China, is it really such a stretch to think, wow, these guys were sailors. They had thousands of years to be sailing. Like by 600 BC, they had shipping channels that went across the world. Is that really so hard to believe?
Okay. Well, do you have any more slides you want to share?
I mean, there are so many. Okay, I could show you. Here's one really interesting one. Check this out right here. Do you see the way that the waters beneath? So this is Apophis, I think. And like I said, we assign all of these animals to gods, but you get in some of the old writings, and they didn't necessarily think that they were gods, but they had divine significance because they represented things in the cosmos and things in their religious motifs. But here we've got, this snake, Apophis here, and he kind of represents the waters beneath, right? And do you see kind of the way he snakes below and then kind of comes up?
Mhm.
Even like these interesting things, like, and the most important part of this is the earth bar, right? Because the earth bar in the religious system, like, is kind of separating the underworld from the overworld, right? The waters beneath with the terrestrial environment. So this earth bar that you see here and here and here, those are all Egyptian motifs. You've got that same earth bar in the one we were just talking about. And it has all the other Egyptian motifs, right? It has the divine tree from Egypt. It has the feline and the duck type thing from Egypt. It's got the same earth bar. It's got the same waters beneath that ended up kind of coming up. That all probably had significance in their mind. They probably really understood what that was saying. Um, anyway, I mean, there's just so much. I mean, like I say, I could go one after another, after another, after another, after another. Um, let me really quick go to now. Let's see. So let me just talk for a second. We're going to jump ahead in history, and we are going to talk about the Middle Ages, right?
Okay.
So about the times that the Vikings start coming to America, we get a history of, let's see. So we have this history of, you know what? We might have to pause this for a second because can you hear that cat meowing in the background?
No,
You can't at all?
nope, not at all.
Okay, then maybe
Keep
we're
going.
fine. All right, yeah, my son's like supposed to be watching the cat. We just got this brand new kitten. It's obviously pretty sad over there. If I get too distracted by it, I might have to go holler at him. In fact, I'm just gonna run really quick and tell him that he needs to. I'll be right
Okay.
back.
I'll just pause it real quick. All right, so we had a little incident there, but everything is ready to go. So, Lance, why don't you continue with your presentation?
Okay, so like I said, we're gonna jump forward in time, right? So we already know the Romans had, they were sending envoys to China. So there was once we get to Roman times, so we already kind of dealt with that 2000 BC, 1500 BC to 600 BC when the Assyrians are there and all these motifs show up. And then we have the Roman times and they're going to China. And it's like, are they coming to the New World? Hard to say. But we jump ahead to 1000 BC and we find a really specific example of what I was talking about before about how there are these trade guilds, right? And the trade guilds are somewhat secretive, but they own these shipping channels and it kind of helps to, it makes them rich. And if you can get a kingdom that kind of is in league with one of these trade guilds, um, and has outposts or colonies. Like we always think of the idea of colonization as being like a post-colonial thing, that it didn't happen until Columbus, right? But we definitely know it was happening in the Middle Ages. The Knights Templar, in fact, were basically a trade guild, with a large amount of secrecy attached to them. But there's something called the Radinites. And this is an interesting thing that you can look up on Wikipedia. So you spell it Radhan, I think, Itees, Radinites. And these Radinites are explained by what is his name? There is a Muslim historian who lived in Babylon, right? And so Europe is kind of going through a little bit of its dark ages, which are culminated by Black Death, which honestly, I think that it's Black Death that kind of erases the cultural memory of pre-Columbian travel
Okay.
until Columbus. I think that it's because Europe's population was just obliterated during the bubonic plague that we kind of lost track a lot of these things.
Hmm.
But so the Radinites, if you look them up, they had trade corridors that went all the way from France, right, and England to China, right, and especially in India. This guy who tells the story, and if you look at the Radinites, it tells it. I can't pronounce any of these names with the Babylonian Muslims, but like it's right here, Ibn Kahorabed,
Okay.
right? And I mean, I can even show right here where, let's see. Anyway, actually, it's hard for me to change tabs because this thing's in the way. But anyway, yeah, go to the Wikipedia article, look these up, check them out. You can check out these guys that I'm talking about, this Ibn Kabora Kordadabe. But he gives, I've read his history,
Okay.
super fascinating. But he explains, he basically tells exactly what I was saying, that there are these groups, like in this case, they're Jewish. And the Jewish groups had kind of an advantage to some of the other groups when it came to this colonization and these trade corridors, because they all spoke Hebrew. So since Hebrew was really codified within their culture from, I mean, 400 BC or so, then all of the different colonies that they have, and they had global colonies, also spoke Hebrew and also had kind of a cohesive culture. And so their trade guilds could easily just go from one Jewish community to another. And they had sea ones and they had land ones, in the Middle Ages, there got to be a couple kingdoms that, because of like these, probably anyway, the idea of the wealth that these trade guilds engendered, helped to make the Khazars and the state that was in southern France, which was a Jewish state, right? And there's a little bit of debate in there, but there's kind of a Jewish debate that called Septimania. Um, we'll see if this comes out, but the Septimanian colony existed in the Rhone Valley of France, and then you had the Khazar, this Jewish Khazaria, right, which existed for a couple hundred years, and the rulers of both these areas, they've all got like Israeli Hebrew names, um, but they kind of took charge of some of these shipping corridors, and they were in tight communication with the head of the Jewish state at the time, the Jewish culture, which was in Baghdad, right? And so they even have a name. If you kind of look up these articles, you'll read about the exarch. And these exarchs are kind of like, instead of a patriarch, they have the patriarch in exile. And so they are these kind of like head rabbis that exist outside of the cultural core of Judaism, which at the time was at Baghdad. But they were all in communication, right? So there's letters that are being sent from Maimonides and the Jewish sages in Spain, who are tightly connected to these guys in Septimania, right? Who are sending letters over to Khazaria, who are in communication with the guys in India. And this was really interesting for me anyway, because right at 800 to 1000 AD, now you suddenly have scientific evidence, right? Like archaeological historical proof where that we had Jewish trade guilds, that the Jews of all people were tightly, connected with these large scale, at least continental Asiatic trade corridors. So then is it so much of a stretch to jump back in time and be like, huh, when did these begin? When did these begin?
So,
Yeah.
are you saying that these trade guilds they were a seafaring people, that they built
Yeah.
their own ships and everything like that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have evidence of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's historical evidence of these ones.
So
So he,
so this was happening. And do we have historical evidence contemporary where it was hinting that they were actually traveling into the New World, that they had some evidence of this, or is this speculation on your part?
okay, so this is where we have to get speculative, right?
Hmm.
And that's where we're going to jump into the Tucson artifacts.
Okay.
Okay. Because first of all, once we connect that there was a trade corridor, and we also, like, I went and I read this, there's two different historians that talk about this in detail, and they talk about land routes too. They had a land route that went through North Africa, they had a land route that went through Asia to China. Um, and he talks about, even when he's here in India, he explains that there's a 40-day sea journey that takes you to a place called Chololan, which in most people they translate that as being that must be somewhere in China, because that could be 40 days, right?
Okay.
But that's kind of interesting because in the New Age histories, especially Xochitl, right? Chololan is kind of their religious capital, probably their religious and their economic capital, and it is in Cholula, right? And that's near Mexico City. So then that kind of opens the door to a bunch of articles I've read lately. And what they're saying is, well, you know what? What's going on here is a lot of these trade corridors that head to the Americas exist in history, but people are reading them and they don't know what they're talking about because they give a name and you don't know what that name is. And so they assign it to a place in the old world. So if it's way far in the east, 40-day sea travel to the east, what you can get, like I mentioned this before, when you get down to the Roaring Twenties, like this was the main, like all of the records, every single record of a sailing journey that circumnavigates the Earth, they all do it in the Southern Hemisphere because
Okay.
there's some really strong winds that go south of Australia here. If you saw that Netflix special, True Spirit, where they had the youngest girl in history who sailed around the world, I mean, that's where she is. She's from Australia, but they do it here in the South because the currents are so fast, right? And in fact, the record is like making it around the entire world in like 40 days, right? They're flying.
Hmm.
So I think she made it in, I can't remember what it was, 120 days or something like that, but she gets stuck for like a month in some of the doldrums. But anyway, you can fly through here. And this is why I believe when it comes to Joseph Smith saying that they landed in southern Chile, I believe that. I used to think, oh, that doesn't make much sense. But it's like, well, that's actually where you would land because you head down to Madagascar, which this Ivan, whatever, the historian, he talks about that they use Madagascar, right? And it doesn't say why he's going there, but next thing you know, after he's mentioning Madagascar, he's talking about there being a 40-day journey out to Chalulan, right? So I think that they are hitting Madagascar and then hitting these fast currents that take them to America, and then they can come right up the coast. And they're actually doing it pretty fast, right? And all the historical accounts of them making it to the New World have been misinterpreted, and they just call the old place the new place. Like it's actually kind of interesting to think about America um, is right in northern France. There's the little peninsula called America, and it's like, well, were those both named after Amerigo Vespucci? Were the Americas really named after Amerigo Vespucci? I mean, there's a lot of really interesting names that sound like things that are later assigned to the New World that we have to kind of ask ourselves, I mean, we should probably relook at some of those histories and especially those names in these old histories to be sure that we're not reassigning kind of far away places to close places. And I think a good example of that are two really well-known examples. One is what is his name? So there's Brendan the Navigator, right? Have you ever heard of Brendan the Navigator?
No, I can't say that I have heard of that.
Um, Here, I'll just show you right here. And all of these things, like there's tons of article. You go to Brendan the Navigator.
Okay, there we go.
Something, what was it? This guy lived in 484 AD.
All right.
And he's got a story, right? And a lot of times we kind of think it's like mythology, and maybe it's mixed with mythology often because they're written a little bit after. But there's a ton of history, in this early period of Britain's history. But he goes off to some faraway land where the Garden of Eden is, but he's taking other people And people always say, well, he's probably going to Iceland or to the Canaries or something like that. Once again, because no one wants to admit that anyone ever went to the Americas, but he goes to a faraway land in the West, right? And so more and more people are reading these early histories and being like, well, maybe this isn't the Canary Islands. And it obviously isn't Iceland. That's kind of a dumb suggestion. So maybe he's going to America, right? And there's another good story from, let's see, what is the other guy's name? Uh, I have it right here too. His name is, there's quite a few of these. They're really Prince Matic, right? And there's a lot of YouTube videos on these too. People are talking about these guys. Prince Matic, he lives 1170 AD, and he's the same way. He's going to some far off land in the West. And it's actually kind of joined with his kingdom. And in this one, like people are being like, well, read the thing. It looks seems pretty clear that he's going to America. And everyone else is like, no, there's no way. But when it comes to Prince Matic, it's like, well, this is after the Vikings came to America. The Vikings were in America in like 1130. This is not hard to believe, right? What might be hard to believe is the idea that this Prince Matic was part of a kingdom that actually had colonies in America, because he talks about going to like some kind of a colony, where it's and there's lots of speculation on this stuff that I think is really fascinating, but that we need to look at again. Like once you see the things I talked about earlier in the presentation that really cement in your mind, that's like, wow, as early as 700 BC, there is incontrovertible proof of cultural diffusion. Now we need to open our minds, right? And then when we talk about Michael Coe that you were talking about before, Michael Coe gives a lot of examples of, especially his wife, who is really into this, of Austronesian cultural diffusion into the Mayan lands. And I think it's pretty convincing, right? And a lot of that stuff is as early as 700 to 600 AD, where we're seeing things like the Bali calendar probably highly influencing the Mayan calendar. So 700, 800 BC, the Austronesians, as they're kind of, in the early stages of setting up Angkor Wat, like one of the biggest, most amazing archaeological ruins in the world, they were probably coming to the Americas, right? And the sweet potato is probably being diffused. And there's actually genetic evidence that is now, it's another funny one, because the genetic evidence was completely lacking when geneticism was in its young years, be like, there's no evidence, but now there's actually quite a few papers that show convincing evidence of genetic diffusion between Austronesia, right, which is Indonesia, and the New World, right? And that this Angkor Wat and the Austronesian Empire, one's in Indochina on the peninsula and one are islands, they ruled the shipping channels at that point for sure between Madagascar and China. And they're pulling kind of wealth out of Africa using Madagascar as their colonial outpost, and then pulling all that wealth into China, vice versa, into India and such. So much crazy evidence. So once we have all that in our mind, okay, so we've got so much, and it's a lot, and it's a
Yes,
fire
there's a
hose. I
lot of
get it.
information you're throwing out there, and for some people, they just, you got this information on the screen, so recommend that you go and check out these resources, including your website. What, and by the way, what's the name of your website, just so how they can
Yeah,
get to it?
gathered in one. Gathered in one. Yeah,
Gatheredin1.com or just gathered dot, I mean,
it's gathered in dot one. So instead of .com, it's dot one. Yeah,
gatheredin.1. Okay.
gathered in dot one.
And so
Yeah, but I mean, you can watch this video a couple times and just go and check out all these resources that I've been showing. And once you've kind of seen them enough and kind of investigated them enough to be like, whoa, like holy cow, that's a lot. There's a lot of evidence. Then you need to go and relook at things like the Michigan artifacts and wonder, well, why do the Michigan artifacts have such medieval looking drawings? Like, how the medieval drawing kind of looks like that child look motif where it's very like rudimentary. Like they look very much like medieval type of tapestries. And then combine that with the Tucson artifacts, which we talked about at the beginning, right? And the Tucson artifacts have actual Hebrew and Latin, and the Las Lunas Decalogue stone, right?
Mhm.
Once again, same with me. I saw the first time I learned about that, for 10 years after I learned about it. It's like, oh, that's probably a fake. Seems like a fake. And then I see this stuff and I'm like, okay, whoa, I need to revisit that. And then you learn that it's like, well, what on earth are these Byzantine variants doing within the Hebrew date to 1000 AD? Like, holy cow, is somebody really forging this? And for some reason, they're doing variants within the Hebrew that really matches with the 1000 AD at the same time that we have these 1000 AD trade guilds that are going all the way across the world.
So just real quick, why don't you tell us now what the Tucson artifacts are, maybe show us some images. I also want to point out that Scott Wolter did an episode on America on Earth about these Tucson artifacts, and he's speaks very highly of these objects. So I've had some off-camera conversations with him about the Tucson artifacts, and then so when you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about them, I thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective on them.
Yeah, yeah. I encourage people to do a little bit of digging into these because they are incredibly fascinating, right? So they're found in Tucson around the turn of the century. So these are pretty old. All right. I think they're found in 1930, 1920, something like that. They were found 5 feet deep, kind of sticking out of an embankment, but under a layer of caliche, right? And like geologists here, like caliche, it can form in certain circumstances. It can form relatively rapidly. I mean, if you had the optimum, maybe you could form it in 5 years, but typically this is taking like hundreds of years in a very arid environment. As you have evapotranspiration from the soil itself, it kind of leaves behind this layer of calcium carbonate within the soil. So it takes a long time to form. But that caliche was actually cemented on the artifacts themselves. So the idea that this guy planted these is very unlikely. Like it really is. It's very unlikely. The idea that somebody planted it in Spanish times, maybe some Spanish guy did a hoax, or maybe even the earliest people, like maybe that's a possibility. But even that seems kind of unlikely because it was in a pretty controlled archaeological context, and they actually had some of the professors from the universities at the time come and look at the site and see where they pulled them out and pull out more. So this is another one of those things where it's kind of done in a controlled environment and yet gets completely dismissed. Probably because when it came out, like no, they haven't even found Lost Meadows. They hadn't even proved that the Vikings were in Nova Scotia yet. That was still in the realm of myth. But the Viking or these Tucson artifacts have a lot of writing on them. In all, I can't remember what the exact number is. You've got 32, here it is, 32 objects. You've got kind of a paddle. You've got these ceremonial swords. You've got these iron lances, right? These spears. You've got crosses. And most of them are made out of lead. And that lead is laced with a lot of zinc, or sorry, a lot of arsenic, which some people have been like, well, that was a European technology. There's no way they could have used them. But it's like, well, they said that they're Europeans. I mean, it makes sense. But they've been adding arsenic as a hardener for, I think that they recently found a Bronze Age copper sword in Scandinavia or something that dated from like 1500 BC, and it had a ton of arsenic in it as a hardener.
So
But
these
here's
these lead objects do you know where could you trace where these were mined from?
They know
Like,
exactly where they're. Oh, yeah. Well, most likely from the region because they are found in there's a bunch of kilns
okay.
by a big mine. Yep. So these are, it would seem most logical that these were mined right near where they came from, right there in Tucson. And there are archaeological ruins in that area that date from before the time of Christ. That was a major hub from the early Hohoki. And yet they find these things in 1930. They have them checked out, and a lot of people believe in them. And yet a lot of people are like poo-poo in that idea, like there's no way. But the most fascinating part of them is that they have actual Hebrew and Latin writing on them, right? And a lot of writing. Like here you can see the Hebrew, here you can see the Latin. So it's like what someone made these. The stories of the people who make them up, like you just read a couple articles. Like there's a lot of people who are like, God, this guy said that there was a guy who knew Latin who lived here 20 years ago and he probably made them. And it's like, well, you're just pulling straws out of your whatever to try and like come up with any idea of who could have fabricated these because they don't even believe that the person who found them was the source of the fabrication because he didn't know Latin and Hebrew, right?
Have these objects been translated?
Yep. So I have on my article here. So this is all in gathered in .1, right? And if you just search on there for the Tucson artifacts, I have all the translations here.
All
And
right.
the translations date from, I think the earliest date on there is, if I remember right, 700 AD. There might even be one a little bit earlier. No, okay, I think there is a name on there that might date from 400 BC.
Okay,
But
so
they're dating from seven because he's talking about the past. They're dating from like 700 to 850 AD. Sorry, not BC, but 700 to 850 AD.
I guess the question would be, why would there be Jewish or there be Hebrew writing on a cross by Jews? Like what kind of that seems to be incongruent. What are your thoughts on that?
So this boils down to that septimania, the kingdom of septimania that I was talking about, right? And these radonate channels. So it was not uncommon during the Middle Ages, and septimania is the best example of it, where these people basically converted. They were still Jewish and they held their Jewish identity, but
Mhm.
ceremonially, you could say they converted to Catholicism. So they were
Okay.
Catholic Jews, right? And if you go, there's a site called Kaulelis.blogspot.com who has a modern day Catholic Jew, and he has dug through so much history, and he's a lot more spurious. He's a lot more like conjectural, but he has got pages and pages and genealogy after genealogy. And I linked to a bunch of them in some of my articles because I think they're really fascinating, even if you kind of might go on out on a limb a little bit. But he's actually dug through every single name that it gives in these artifacts and created a genealogy and how these guys were related to that kingdom and how they probably dated back to Roman times, that there were Roman colonies, right? Because remember the Etruscan figurine next to Mexico City. So he believes that there was a colony near Mexico City, near Cholula, right? Which also matches with that other history I told you about, where they're saying they're going 40 days to this Cholula place, right? Cholulan. So there is a Roman Jewish colony in Mexico City, and there is a Roman Jewish colony in Arizona and New Mexico. And I found all this stuff recently, but coincidentally, this all matches 100% with my model. Like I say, my model is totally different than the Heartland is Hinterland models because I have the Valley of Mexico, right, and the Morelos Valley as being my land of Zarahemla, and the Zapotecs as being my land like it matches to a T with all of this information that's being found. Like to a T, it does not match with the other models. It matches perfectly with my models.
So, did you want to talk a little bit about your model just so people can get an understanding of your Book of Mormon model? Because I know a lot of people would be interested in that and how it ties into what we talked about today.
I mean, I'll just point it out really quick,
Hmm.
and try and just give a really broad overview. But if you want to go to my gathering.1 and go to the archaeology tab here, right, and I have a short overview right here that really just kind of gives the nuts and bones. But if you go down to this Book of Mormon geography found, and I have, like I said, I've got 25 years, thousands and thousands of hours working here. And it is the most detailed model in existence, right? So I have every single site mapped out. And this happened when I got off my mission. All this stuff started coming to me, and I've had really crazy experiences where I couldn't wake up in that hypoponic state, like where you're half awake and half asleep, and had these kind of
Uh-huh.
like crazy experiences where someone's talking to me, and you could say maybe it's a dream, maybe it's real, but kind of teaching me a bunch of this stuff.
So,
And
can you click
so,
on that map and just kind of make that larger so the people can see it?
yeah,
All right. So this is your okay. So this is your model,
this is
and
my model.
okay,
So
and
you can see here the land. And let me give one broad overview right here. So this is the internal model of the Book of Mormon, right? You've got the land of Nephi, land of Zarahemla, land northward, land of many waters, right? The narrow neck, which I'm kind of showing here. It could be a peninsula, it could be an isthmus. We don't know. Doesn't give a whole lot of detail. I have articles on all these things, and here's my correlations. So the internal model land of Nephi on my model is the Zapotec Empire, right? My city of Nephi is Monte Alban. And these dates match specifically, like, I mean, perfectly, like right at 550 BC, the Zapotec Empire kind of like builds Monte Alban, which I have as my city of Nephi. They built this east-facing two-room, two-column
Lance, just
temple.
just real quick, just so people get an understanding, because you got two maps here. Explain to me, you got internal versus external model comparison. Just give me the broad overview of what you're getting at with these two different maps here.
Okay, yeah, thanks for keeping me on track. Feel free to cut in anytime. The one on the right is the internal model, and
Okay.
it's quite similar to a lot of internal models you see out there,
Right.
right?
Yeah, a lot you see that's similar to a lot of maps you see, like, okay, if we're just going by the description as given in the Book of Mormon, this is what it would look like. And then
Yeah,
when you're comparing that to what you're laid out on and actually in a real world map.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Because the internal model is pretty specific as far as there being a river Sidon, there being a head of Sidon with Manti near it, and that being in a narrow strip of wilderness that's between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, and there being a land northward. So my land northward is the Heartland, right? The Heartland model is my land northward. And I think that's where the Mulekites landed. That's where Cumorah is. There's only one Cumorah. That
Okay.
all happened here where there's many waters in the eastern United States. My desolation goes all the way from the southwest, right? Where the people built with cement, where there was cannibalism, where there's a lot of things that match with the Book of Mormon.
Hmm.
And it stretches down to West Mexico, where it turns into the land of Bountiful. As soon as you get out of the rain shadow of the Gulf of California, which is part of my narrow neck. Narrow neck is kind of a complicated term. It's mentioned lots of different ways. So you have to see my article on that to get more specific on that. But then my land of Bountiful is the Mexican highland, right? And my Zarahemla is down from Morelos, and then it ends up getting pushed northward. And in the end, by Fourth Nephi, my Zarahemla is Teotihuacan, right? It's the
Okay,
biggest ruins on the continent.
I just also want to give me context here. Where do the Jaredites fit in this whole thing?
So the Jaredites we know landed in the land of desolation. Their heartland, where they begin, is the land of desolation, which it says is by the narrow neck. Never says anything happens on the narrow neck, but by the narrow neck. So and I have a whole map of this. This is where my Jaredite heartland is, actually in West Mexico. And from there, they spread north and south, right? And the north version goes up into the heartland. And so all the early Adana mounds and the Watson Break is a great example, Poverty Point, all these really early things, those are all part of my Jaredites, right?
Okay.
And I think that's where the main population center of the Jaredites was. But the southern arm of the Jaredites, which comes a little later, they go down and they form the Olmec. So all the great correlations that people find with the Olmec, right? Those are part of my Jaredites too, right? But if you're
You have Jaredites both in the heartland, if you will, and also as the Olmecs. So you have
yeah,
them as the Adena and the Olmecs. Is that what you're saying?
exactly. Yeah.
And are you saying that there's cultural parallels between the Olmecs and the Adena? I mean,
So there's not a whole lot of artifacts to grow to make those cultural matches with, other than the dates match, and they're both building mounds,
okay.
right? Because most of the artifacts are mound building sites. And for sure the more impressive ones are in North America, right? And so if you just because I like the Teotihuacan Olmecs, they're a great match. Like they're probably the best thing that the Mesoamerican folks have going for them because they really, it's like, well, this seems like it matches perfect. Except for once you start like picking at that model, it's like, holy cow, there's so many problems in that model. Because if they're your Jaredites, then who are all the people up in North America? And who is in Quiquilco? Right? And who are all these Jaredites that go all the way up to West Mexico and the shaft tomb culture? And so the Book of Mormon just never even mentions them.
So
It actually makes better sense this way.
I'm just curious because, of course, it's implied in the Book of Mormon that when they landed to the land of promise, that it was an empty land, and that there weren't any other peoples there. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying, or would you say that there were other people there that aren't talked about in the Book of Mormon?
No, so I have two different timelines that I kind of allow space for being true.
Hmm.
So one would be the traditional one that they arrive around 2000 BC because a lot of people signed the Tower of Babel to around 2000 BC. And if that's the case, when they got here, this land was full,
All
right?
right.
There's tons of people. But there are zero evidence of elephants or curlams and cumans, whatever those are, at
Mhm.
2000 BC. And I mean, sure, like there's no evidence of elephants from, Carthage either, where Hannibal's crossing the Alps with elephants. But really, I mean, it just seems kind of weird that we've got elephants and kind of two extinct animals that are especially good for the food of man called curlams and cumans. That fact in the Book of Mormon makes me think, you know what, maybe what's going on here is that there is lost time in the Book of Ether. And that what the Book of Mormon is talking about, the very earliest culture actually correlates with the Clovis, with the very first inhabitants of America, right? Which date archaeologically to 14,000 to 12,000 BC at the end of the Ice Age. So because there are some strong correlations between the two, because we know that the Clovis, the first Indians that suddenly arrive in the Americas, they are eating elephants. That's their main food source. They are also eating other megafauna, right? Curlams and cumans. They also hunt them to extinction when a huge climatic event happens called the Younger Dryas. Well, the Book of Mormon says the same thing, right? The Book of Mormon says that, as it appears, like a while after they came, suddenly it says there's this giant dearth. It says there's a great dearth. And then it says the animals start to flee southward and the people follow their carcasses and then eat them all. It literally says they eat them all. And it's like, well, that sounds really similar to what archaeologists have found with the Younger Dryas extinction event, where we've got both this climatic dearth, this huge issue, right, where it doesn't rain and the climate changes, and then they hunt all the megafauna to extinction. So that's why I think that it's more likely that whether there's a break in time or the dates are wrong, there's lots of ways you could come up with it. But I think the earliest Jaredites actually correlate with the earliest Native Americans, the Clovis.
Okay, well, of course, now was there any other charts you wanted to show or anything else you wanted to give in your presentation? Because we could just go back to full screen if unless there's some more stuff you want to show. Or
Uh,
we can go back to screen share too.
yeah, yeah, no, this is fine.
Okay, so why don't you exit out of screen share and we can talk a little bit more about this because you've presented a lot of information today, and I'm sure people's
So
heads are
much.
spinning.
And I'm going to tell you,
And
this is like the tiniest bit
I
of
know it's just the
what,
tip of the iceberg. I
yeah,
totally get that. But I like having these conversations. I like talking to people that look at things differently. But now when you're pulling in, like, okay, so now how do we make this work that the Jaredites could be Clovis? Because you're finding parallels between the Jaredites and Clovis, but yet we're dating the dates are like off by like 10,000 years, right?
yeah, yeah.
So how do you were able to make that work?
I mean, that's actually not uncommon. So it's called the lacuna. So if I'm going to wear my scientific hat, I would say, well, let's look at the Jaredite thing. What we've got is they find a stone or some plates, the 24 plates, and they bring it to Mosiah, and Mosiah translates it. And he translates this history and he gives a genealogy. Well, the Book of Ether that talks about the Jaredites gives zero dates. There's not a single date in there. In fact, there's nothing that we can even create a date from. Like it only gives the ages of like 5 people in there. So we're basically just completely speculating that the Book of Ether is a continuous history, father to son, and that we know its date range. We don't. I think more likely they got this record that was left on 24 plates, and that record was like we see today in like the what is the Red Book or whatever, where there's a mythical slash historical record of somebody's people, and it gives a genealogy as well as they know it, but there's tons of missing time in there, right? And so he's basically getting a history of North America from these plates and he's writing it in the Book of Ether. And it has a ton of information, but it's also missing, it's still only 100th part of actually what existed. And that actually, hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. So if you want that, because there's some people, and the same thing happens in the Bible, right? If if you want to say the scriptures are inerrant and there's no mistakes in them, well, then you're going to have to say, well, the archaeology is totally wrong. And you're going to have to do that a lot in the Bible and in the Book of Mormon. You have to be like, yeah, archaeology is wrong. Even though I think my model definitely hugs to archaeology as tight as anything out there. But you're still going to have to say archaeology is wrong in a lot of ways. But if you want to say, well, no, the Bible actually is wrong in a lot of places. The Book of Mormon is wrong in a lot of places. Ether is one of those books. It gives a history that is missing tons of time out of that. But its beginning is actually the earliest inhabitants when they were living with elephants and curlams and cumans. That's logical. Do you,
So so okay, so now okay, I'm just trying to work this out in my mind. So if the Clovis are the Jaredites, how did the Clovis get here? Because this would have been the land bridge theory that says that the Clovis came here. Are you saying that around 12,000 BC there was a seafaring people that crossed the Pacific Ocean 12,000 years ago?
yeah, which is being hypothesized by archaeologists now, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's
some
true.
people say the ice-free corridor wasn't open yet, and so they must have come by boat. Like honestly, when the Fukushima earthquake happened, there were like giant cement boxes that floated off the coast of Japan and ended up in California.
Yeah.
Like and it didn't take that long. Like they've got the dates of them just floating there. So if these guys could have built any kind of, they could have been reed boats. Who knows what kind of rudimentary boats that they were. Like we know they weren't modern boats because they had roofs and they had holes that they stopped up. And they could have just floated straight across with the currents, just like is being speculated by lots of archaeologists today. So it actually
That's
solves the
true.
problem.
That is true. They are now speculating that, it makes a lot more sense too if you look at, where just by hugging the coasts, even, they have that idea, and so I think there's a lot more to our human history than we realize. I think it's interesting. We didn't talk about Göbekli Tepe, but you had some images there,
Hmm.
and it just shows that the idea of building a monolithic civilization, a culture that is able to build monoliths, build structures dating that far back
Hmm.
is mind blowing. It completely rewrites human history. And so now it opens up. Look, if human history is being rewritten of what we thought are ancient, ancestors were not capable of, but they were capable of. We were thinking they were just hunter-gatherers, but here you have look like a civilization, a culture that was able to build these items, and then interestingly enough, to deliberately bury them, which I find intriguing.
Yeah.
I think that there's so much we don't know. So maybe the Book of Mormon can kind of inform this conversation, saying, well, look at all the stuff that you thought was implausible now is more plausible now than it was in the 19th century or even in the 20th century. What do you say
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And like I mentioned this calais.blogspot.com Jewish, Catholic Jewish guy. I
Hmm.
mean, he literally says in there, I am not a Mormon. I don't believe in Mormonism, but he's descended from the Ojibwe, right? And what's that one guy's? I can't remember his name right now, so I won't go there. But that, like he
Oh,
says, this is
Chief Mitiga?
Chief Mitigaw, yeah,
Yeah.
Chief
Hmm.
Mitigaw. So this guy who writes this blog, and it's not Chief Mitigaw. He says, I have this history, and it says this, and the Mormon he believes that Joseph Smith must have found it and plagiarized it because it's so similar to what he puts in there. Like I say, he has Roman colonies, he has all of these Jewish colonies, and he's not Mormon. So
Hmm.
this stuff is like becoming believable from an archaeological perspective and from a historical perspective of a completely non-Mormon who doesn't believe in Mormonism. And not only that, he puts like the southern colony where my Zarahemla is, and we came to that conclusion independently. So maybe that's coincidence, could be, right? But it's at least very interesting. And like I say, I have given the tiniest bit. Like I haven't even talked about how similar my land of Nephi and my temple is to Monte Alban, like so incredibly similar. There's nowhere else where you have an east-facing two-room, two-columned temple with a huge altar in front of it that shows up right when the Book of Mormon says, right? I've talked all about my Captain Moroni stuff, where suddenly you have a line of fortress cities show up all the way across Mesoamerica, right? From the East Coast to the West Coast. They all move out of their valley settlements and move up into hilltop fortresses, just like it says Captain Moroni did, because this war is erupting, right? And they find that in archaeology, and it's definitely the pressure between the Zapotec Empire and the Highland Empire. I haven't talked about my Laconius and how Teotihuacan, like the Book of Mormon gives a better explanation for why Teotihuacan got built than archaeology does. Like archaeologists are saying, well, maybe because the lava flow went over Quiquilco, then the people are fleeing to Teotihuacan, and that's why it just springs out of nowhere, and it suddenly has 100,000 people like in a day, and it's building this multicultural thing. The Book of Mormon says, no, no, this is Laconius, which is a Roman name, by the way, Latin. Like, where does that come from? It doesn't even say in the Book of Mormon, but it says Laconius gathers all the people from the land northward because the Ghanaian robbers, right? These like guerrilla warfare people are getting so bad, they gather them all into one central city. They do it in Zarahemla and in the border of Zarahemla and Bountiful, and they build a giant, like basically fortress city to protect themselves from this invading army, right? That's a better explanation of what the archaeologists give because Teotihuacan comes out of nowhere and within 100 years has 100,000 people. It's the biggest city on the continent, one of the biggest cities in the world. And they're building pillar pyramids the size of the Egyptian pyramids, right? And how do you fit that into people who have their Zarahemla down in the Grijalva or Sumacinta, like at Gobel? So many issues with that. But anyway, it answers a lot of these questions incredibly, but it's so much information and so hard to like I'm going to make videos of this sometime, but really you've got to watch 10, 20 hours before you even start to get into all this crazy correlations.
Well, it's so interesting to me. I love this kind of stuff. Let me just pull up something real quick here so people can check this out. So your website is gathered in dot one, and it says here, Book of Mormon found tours and conference. So is that something that's upcoming, by the way?
Yeah, like we did a tour last year down to Monte Alban and to Teotihuacan, right, to see the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. And that was pretty cool. And we're going to try and do that every year. We'll see if we have enough people who want to do it. Just where I go and we spend a week. We'll spend a couple days down at the beach too. And then
You
I'm,
know,
I'm trying to do some tours to Chaco Canyon, some of the Anasazi lands, and then we'll start the conferences. I don't know, either this year or next year sometime.
so basically all the resources that you've discussed today, you can find all the links and everything that you've discussed today would be on your website here.
Yeah, yeah. And if you go to that archaeology tab and just scroll down, you can get a lot of information. Like some of the things that we haven't hit on that are really important parts of the model, like how that correlates with the internal model, how the narrow neck of land fits into it, the difference between the narrow neck and the narrow passes, some of these other artifacts that they found. correlations with the Mayan calendar, Mayan numerical systems, um, a lot of really interesting stuff. The Xochicalco stela is super interesting. The language that they found on the Anthon transcript, actually the characters document, right?
Hmm.
That's only been found one place, and that's right by my land of Zarahemla, right in the Morelos Valley. Someone actually found a huge stela. It has all this writing that has shares characters with it, right? And
That is
so
that been I thought that may have been debunked as a fake. Is that or
so the Padilla plates were debunked.
okay.
Um, and once again, that was because the cutting on it, they thought, well, this is European technology. Um, this is not Mesoamerican technology. But anyway, you just have to go ahead and people have to note for themselves. The stela itself, like that could easily be carved. It like the front side of the stela is a well-known like actual archaeological stela. Like there's no debating that. The question is that backwriting written later and totally fake? And if it is fake, you have to look at that lock that they found with it and be like, well, that's the one that makes me think. Because instead of being carved into the lock, they've etched everything but the lettering out. And it's like, whoa, that is a sophisticated fake. If somebody seriously did that, and then they're throwing in linear B, like slight variations of linear B within the demonic kind of lookalikes of the stuff that's on the Anthon transcript. So it's similar stuff. Even in the Mormon community, they typically just don't buy any of that stuff because it's totally outside of their model, right? Whereas if they would have found that right inside of the Grijalva River Basin, they kind of be like, oh, let's look at that more carefully. Let's try and translate that. But
Hmm. I find this really fascinating stuff, Lance. And here I just want to go back to here because not only do you have gathered in dot one, LDS Universalism, archaeology, prophecy, and Reformation. And honestly, Lance, I think there's a lot more conversations we can have that can also talk about these various themes. It's you really have a lot of interesting stuff. I also just want to point out that you do also do the Utah Geology.com.
yeah.
And you have some really great resources about Utah geology. Maybe just talk a little bit about this resource as well.
Yeah, that's more my academic professional thing. So when it comes to Utah Geology.com, like most of that is pretty down the line scholarly. I'm not doing so much conjecture or kind of religious ideas. But yeah, I have my career as a geologist, and write a bunch of articles, do a bunch of 3D modeling of geology, and then I also do on the side kind of tours to Zion and Bryce. And I have some ideas when it comes to interesting things about the Ice Age. That there's some articles on there. Um, but yeah, geology is kind of my career and my passion for sure. And paleo history, how things have changed over time, and then archaeology is kind of something I spend a lot of time on, and it's my second passion.
Great. So I'm going to have links to both of these websites in the description. And I think if you're interested in geology, or if you're interested in archaeology, you're interested in diffusionism, you're interested in history, human history, is the Book of Mormon an even more ancient document than we even realized? Is the story of the Book of Ether an actual ancient, telling us the history of ancient American history, even telling us the story of the Clovis people? I've never heard any of this before, folks. I'm telling you right now, I'm watching this in the same time that you're watching it. I'm seeing all these facts. I'm still processing this information that I'm receiving. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to push back and be skeptical. But I think it's an interesting speculation just to think like, okay, does the Book of Mormon actually, in one sense, hint towards giving us the complete history of the New World and or humanity's um, settling of the New World that goes back to 12,000 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
And this is all like I'd say that probably 75% of everything that I've got is completely novel. Like you're just not going to find it other places. Like I said, Ed Goebel stuff in the hinterland, it's just totally different. This is all completely new stuff. And so you can decide whether I'm crazy and whether like voices I hear in my head while I'm asleep are just me hallucinating or whether I've had some really, I don't know, crazy stuff that I don't believe sometimes, but it's interesting stuff. It's kind of fun.
Oh, I just see a little kitten has snuck in the room there behind you. That's
Yeah.
what's your cat's new name? What's your cat's name?
Pippin.
Pippin.
I've got a
Oh,
bunch of Lord of the Ring fans. This is
oh,
Pippin. He
that's
was the one who
great.
was hollering earlier. I swore we wouldn't have a cat, but my kids won.
They won. The kids won. All right. Well, I found this to be a very fascinating conversation. Like I said, a lot of information to process, folks, but that's what we are here. Maybe rewatch this again. Go to his website. There's abundance of resources there. And just look into it yourself, see what you think. I always tell people, I said, I like to have all these different ideas and different views come onto the program, but I also have, geologists on, anthropologists on, and I'd love to hear what Thomas Murphy thinks about this model. I'd be really interested to hear what Scott Walter has to say about that. So we'll continue the conversation and the dialogue. And Lance, I really want to have you back on because it just sounds like there's stuff that we've talked about on the phone and off camera, ideas that you have that I find fascinating that are unique. And you kind of bring a really interesting perspective to the table. And I love people that do that. I'd rather than just kind of rehash everything that you've been taught from the pulpit, but you're actually doing your own research. And it seems like you're a very inquisitive person and just a cool dude.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'd love to come back, talk a little bit about big tent Mormonism, maybe
Yes.
creationist debate, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, creationism, big tent Mormonism. The tent of Mormonism is much larger than you anticipate. And Lance actually has scriptures to actually give that information. And I think that's interesting too. It's another way of looking at what is a one true church actually look like. And is it just the physical building or is it much bigger than that? And I think that resonates with me as well, my friend. So, any final words you'd like to share with the audience?
No, we've already given the fire hose. So just go dig in if you feel like it. And like I say, most people it's so hard to even this is such a small amount of what there is out there. So hopefully I'll get some videos where people can digest and actually
Yeah.
get a handle on the model because we're just given such little pieces.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could. Yeah, let us know when you're going to start doing that, and we'll have you back on to promote that as well. So, folks, we'll have links in the description to his website and things that we discussed about, as well as links for those of you who'd like to financially support us here at Mormon Book Reviews. I really couldn't do it without you, and I want to thank those who have been making contributions to the channel. Could not do it without you. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.